Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to start our session on fostering better and more interoperable norms, recommendations for enhanced regulations and public policy with regard to space debris mitigation and remediation. Last year, in November 2021, at the 4th Paris Peace Forum, we launched the Net Zero Space Initiative to protect the Earth's orbital environment, and we've been calling for concrete actions to tackle the pressing issues, challenges of space debris, with the ultimate aim of achieving sustainable use of outer space by 2030. That declaration states, inter alia, by launching the Net Zero Space Initiatives, we're calling for a global commitment to achieving sustainable use of outer space for the benefit of all humankind by 2030. We recommend urgent action from 2021 onwards to rapidly contain and then reduce the ongoing pollution of Earth's orbital environment. First, by avoiding further generation of hazardous space debris, and second, by remediating existing hazardous space debris. This initiative is now supported by some 50 stakeholders from various different categories of space users, including in-orbit services, space situation awareness providers, satellite operators, civil society, academics, space agencies, public authorities, and launchers from some 30 countries. 2 working groups have been established in the past year, and one of these working groups has been developing policy recommendations in relation to the observation and commitment of the Net Zero Space Declaration, and that resulted in a white paper that analyzes the existing binding requirements in national regulations and licensing processes around the globe. We studied the existing binding requirements concerning space debris mitigation and remediation within the national laws of 17 spacefaring and emerging spacefaring nations. And the recommendations of that working group are included in that white paper and aim to pave the way for the establishment of minimum requirements that allow for better international interoperability of national legal framework. So we have an expert panel here today, and we will conduct our discussion in 2 rounds of discussions. First, we have a topic that we titled Fostering Better and More Interoperable Norms for Space Sustainability, Feedback on a Multi-Stakeholder Proposal. And we have 2 speakers who will each present their view on this topic for about 3 minutes, after which we will have about 20 minutes of discussions, and all stakeholders around the table are welcome to take the floor at that time. We have, as I said, a large group ranging from satellite operators, data providers, government agencies, industry. I have to say I feel a bit lonely as the only woman on this panel, but I'm sure that next year we can make an effort to have some more gender balance. Without further ado, I want to give the floor first to Miguel Angel Molina Cobos, who is Deputy General Manager and Chairman of the Space Council of GMV. He has worked for GMV since 1988, where he held various positions as head of mission analysis, space engineering, flight dynamics activities, Director of Control Center's business unit, and more. And as the second speaker, we have Mr. Chirag Parikh, who is the Executive Secretary of the United States National Space Council at the White House, who prior to his current position at the National Space Council, where he had already worked before, was also Director of Defense Policy and Strategy, and he has also served as Senior Director at Azure Space, Office Director of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, and Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Science and Technology at the National Intelligence Council. So I will not speak further, and I will first give the floor to Miguel, and I have to say, there you are.
Here.
Go ahead, Miguel.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you to be here, to the invitation. It's a real pleasure for me. It's an it's impressive, the environment and the activities and the people that present in this activity, and then it's a real honor for me to be here. Then let me start to say again what we are living. I suppose we are aware about the problem that we are facing, this space debris problem, with more than 35,000 objects around us which are considered as dangerous. Dangerous for the existing missions and dangerous also for our day-by-day life. I don't know if you are aware, there is a case that occurred 1 week ago. I don't know if you are aware about the problem that we face in Spain during a little bit less than 1 hour. The air traffic was closed during this time in 2 or 3 airports, Barcelona, Ibiza, and some more, and affecting 800 flights and thousands of people. Why? Because there was a debris coming from a satellite, debris from a launcher, Chinese launcher, that was expecting to re-enter in this area. Of course, was not the case, because if not, we will see more details in the news, and probably you have not seen anything more. But the re-entry was 1 hour later. 1 hour later in the Pacific Sea, as always. Normally, the debris are going to the Pacific Sea or somewhere like this. But this is because of probability. But in this case, we were very close. We were really very close to have a real problem. Then, this is affecting us. This is a real global issue today. It's no more something that can consider that will happen eventually. No, we can have a problem today, tomorrow, and it can affect our life because of the way to work is possibly affected by this issue. And as a global problem, need to be considered as this, and then to try to find solutions, global solutions. It's difficult. An approach could be to say we need to impose rules and norms to the new satellite that we will launch, or we need to impose rules and norms for the way in which we are controlling the existing satellites. This is something I believe is needed. How we impose this, how we deploy this approach. We can go for a global approach. We say, globally, with a global treaty that we define for all the people, all the countries, everybody need to follow this. It will be difficult. I don't believe that everybody will follow this, and we will in the way to put everybody in agreement. But what we can do, go for something more simple. Go for country by country, regional aspect, activities located in different areas, relevant areas in the domain of the space, and doing things in a coordinated way. This is what is important, coordination and exchange of information. And in this sense, Europe, for example, is working today a major role in this activity. We have 2 activities in deployment and development, like the SST project for the observation of the debris, or the STM activity, in which there are many forums today and many associations, workshops, and activities trying to define the rules and how the rules will need to be imposed and to be deployed. In this sense, we can highlight, for example, activities currently done in US or in France, where they are defining real laws that are behind the possibility to establish the conditions for future launches of future satellites. In this sense, I would like to make a quick comparison of this problem with a pandemic. We know very well pandemic activities. We have been living one. In this sense, we can say there are 3 activities, main activities that we need to do, and how we need to collaborate on this. Prevention. At prevention level, we need to define rules. We need to define, for example, debris mitigation plans for new launchers. We need to define end-of-life and disposal rules that need to be applied, and to put behind this a legal or rules or aspect that can be really impose the operators and the future launchers to define what we are saying and certifying that they will do what they are saying. Of course, this is prevention. Now, the virus is flying, then we need to do a diagnosis and monitor. We need to check what is happening. We need to check what is the debris, where they are, what is the position, what are the risks, and eventually provide services like collision risk services or re-entry services, which are needed to avoid the major effects on our life. In this sense, we need also to follow, to define the rules, to define these services, and how they will be applied. And let me finish with the last one. Once we have been doing, we avoid more virus because we are doing good prevention. We isolate the existing ones, and now let's go for the treatment and cure. In this case, it's similar what we are, the new services that we are calling active debris removals or in-orbit services, which are under development. There are many companies doing today some demonstration around this in Europe, in US, and then in this sense, of course, we need also to define the rules and the licensing conditions that for the future these missions will be applied and will be operating. And let me finish. I think I just in time. It's okay?
Fine. Thank you.
Good.
Thank you, Miguel.
Thank you.
Next, let's hear from Chirag Parikh. I'm not sure where you are seated. You are over there.
Right
Hello,
next to you.
sir.
Yes, yes. Thank you again to everybody for inviting us over here. It's been quite a week. U.S. and France actually just completed its first comprehensive dialogue on space, talking about all the important elements of all our different sectors of civil, commercial, and national security. And it's great to end it with the Paris Peace Forum here. I think before I go into my remarks, I think just walking through out there, it reminded me, why are we here? We're not here just to talk about space sustainability. We're not here to talk about space debris. We're not here to talk about space for space. We're here we understand the enabling element that space has for our ability to, for instance, the booths out in the center back there, to monitor climate change. Our ability to use space to be able to predict the impacts of climate and to be able to look for where it's being compliant and where it's not being compliant. In a similar sense, with respect to why do we have space, it's so we can bridge the unconnected communities. It's the ability to be able to bring information to disadvantaged communities. And as we've seen, particularly with the crisis in Ukraine, is the ability to ensure that democracy continues to prevail around the world. And we need to be able to connect these entities. We need to inform these entities through our space systems. And so if we don't have that environment, that domain to be able to operate in, to be able to support the people that are on the other side of this wall, then we have bigger problems on Earth than we may have in space along the way. And so, because most of us here are space experts, there is no need to identify the challenges. We understand, and the paper identifies the challenges very well here. And there's a lot of new activities in space, a lot of new activities. I learned some more outside here about salvaging space debris to be able to use new capabilities, which provide incredible benefits for us both in space, but like I said, on the Earth as well. On the other hand, we have some long-term sustainability challenges, what we've talked about. Governance of activities, anti-satellite development, space weaponization concerns. And as we know, those provide direct impacts to our ability. And so from a US policy perspective, we've identified some of these issues. We released a space priorities framework in December of last year that highlights the importance of us continuing to prioritize space sustainability in our policies, our regulations, and our operations to minimize the impact of space activities on our outer space environment and to be able to mitigate, track, and I think this is new to a lot of policy elements, remediate space debris, and be able to develop and implement international best practices in cooperation with our allies, our partners, even strategic competitors, as well as our commercial sector to ensure that we have the ability to have space sustainability. And ultimately, we're looking to be able to have responsible global governance of space. And to this end, we're engaging the international community. That's one of the reasons why I'm here today, to uphold and strengthen a rules-based international order for space and be able to promote these in different fora to include the United Nations, industry associations, government-to-government relations. So very briefly on what the United States is doing to implement some of these elements along the way. One area is to go after the behaviors that are highly irresponsible, and chief among them are the testing of direct descent anti-satellite debris. For most of you who've probably seen the charts of the increasing amount of debris from Sputnik 1 to today, you will notice that there are three significant spikes in that debris area. Number one is the Chinese direct descent ASAT over 15 years ago now. Mm-hmm. Number two was the collision of a Cosmos and Iridium satellite in space. And number three was the most recent Russian direct descent ASAT test that occurred in November of last year, almost to the day, as a matter of fact. And so And so in April of this year, Vice President Harris, as the chair of the National Space Council of the United States, committed the United States to not to conduct destructive direct descent anti-satellite testing and have us establish an international norm of this. The Vice President also called on other nations to make similar commitments, and a number of nations actually have, up to this point, made similar commitments. Additionally, this past September, the Vice President said we would introduce these capabilities into the United Nations to be able to establish this as an international norm within the first committee. That discussion, that vote, happened last week. 154 countries agreed that voted yes on this behavior. I think only 8 or so voted against this behavior. So now this will go to the General Assembly for vote here in the coming weeks. And we think that's a very important but significant step to be able to address space sustainability. A second area is, which we began in the last administration and we've continued in this administration, is the compliance with Artemis Accords as well. So we talk about military perspectives from the direct descent ASAT commitment. Artemis Accords is more towards a civil space commitment as well. And that's grounded in the Outer Space Treaty. It's non-legally binding declaration of principles and rules. That includes registration of space objects. Not every country still registers space objects, even though that's a UN request along the way. Deconfliction of activity. So to your point about the Chinese rocket body coming in, no transparency, no deconfliction from anybody to say what's coming there. And the release of scientific data and emergency assistance. And really, what we're talking about here is how do we instantiate these capabilities? And so the paper that was published talked about being able to bring these into some of our regulations. And so one of the things that we've noticed in the United States and around the world is that our regulatory regime is focused on 3 areas. It's focused on communications, it's focused on remote sensing, and it's focused on launch and reentry. But you see all these activities, when you start doing in-space assembly and manufacturing, on-orbit servicing, on-orbit refueling, lunar mining and excavation, how do you ensure sustainability of those operations when you don't have a regime or environment? So this past September, the Vice President has tasked us as an interagency to go and look at what we call novel space activities. What is the framework to do this? But I think the key component with respect to this is the fact that in that narrative, it's also to consider sustainable space operations as we develop the framework and rules to be able to govern these capabilities as prescribed to us by the Outer Space Treaty. And last but not least, another area is our continued engagement with our private sector. So many countries, we've seen so many companies here in France, we've seen so many companies across Europe, across Asia, and certainly across North America developing incredible space capabilities. It is incumbent not just on the governments, but it's incumbent on the private sector to develop norms of behavior, responsible behaviors, best practices that we can work with collaboratively and bring into government frameworks along the way. And I think that follows deeply with what some of the suggestions from this paper is. So looking forward to the discussion here with you, and hopefully I didn't go too far over time as well. So thank you very much.
You're excused. It's fine. It's interesting to hear. You're the only government representative here, so you are gladly given the extra few minutes. Thank you very much for our 2 speakers from GMV and the National Space Council. And I don't know if everybody has had the chance to have a look at the white paper, but looking at what is in these national laws, it actually became clear that there is not much in legislation as yet. There is a low development of binding regulations, and there are also different kinds of making regulations, sometimes in hard law, sometimes in decrees, or sometimes even by contract. And also sometimes regulations are not available in languages, official languages of the United Nations, so there's also a lack of transparency. So I would like to open the floor for discussion, for reactions to our 2 speakers, or to any points in the white paper relating to how governments should act and should move forward. If you would like to take the floor, please let me know and state your name and make your intervention. Yes.
Bonjour, Jean-Philippe Arsenault, North Star Earth and Space. I'm glad to be here and honored to be considered the space expert. I bring 5 years in this sector, but 15 years in politics and governments before that. And one thing, maybe as an introductory comment before we dive in the paper, to your point, sir, yes, space is existential, and we all understand that here. The thing is, many people in governments don't understand that, and I think it's a collective challenge for anyone involved in space to really make it consistently a point of starting any discussion and reiterating with decision makers in big organizations why space is crucial, is existential, and it's not time wasted. And that's why I use a little time to restate it, that it's something important for anyone involved in this industry. But then on this topic, you know, on recommendation number 3, we state that we need an increased cooperation between nations to tackle the challenges of space debris, and I agree. But speed, time is of the essence, and speed is necessary as well. It's a common statement of this paper as well. And for this, you know, governments, having been in governments for over a decade as well, are not the fastest to come up with regulations, with legislation. There is competition for legislative time with a whole range of topics. That is why making space a priority and the importance is key. But for this, the private sector and the technologies it brings, I believe at this time is also key. In the space sector, writ large, there's been a revolution in the last years of making use of the private sector. Governments are less at the center of what's happening in space. But on the topic of space debris, we need to find a way to foster new technologies, and for that, the private sector is key. And the discussion on regulations or rules in parallel is imperative. And voila, I'll leave it at this for now.
Thank you, Mr. Arsenault, for that reality check. It's true that it will be difficult, it may take time, but it is an urgent issue. And as Miguel also said, it may happen first at national level, but we have to look also at the regional and the global component. I believe that global standards is of course, the best way forward for everyone. Who may I give the call? John.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm John Janka from Viasat. We joined the initiative a year ago. I'm very proud to have worked with all of the experts around the room and their support staffs. I think it's been very enlightening. You know, on a couple of things that were discussed give rise to some additional thoughts. I appreciate you know, how terrific ASAT tests are. Those type of intentional actions can't be condoned. They have horrible consequences. And forgive the comparison, but the truth is that a collision between two satellites, regardless of the cause, has the same consequences and spreads fields of debris. And just as we should do everything we can to avoid intentional destruction of satellites, I think it's critical that we start to manage what I see as an increasing and undue risk of collisions that's occurring because of the way space is being populated. We have increasingly large numbers of larger and larger satellites. So that means many more satellites, much more mass, much more cross-sectional area. All of that increases the risk of collisions. And you know, to paraphrase Professor Hugh Lewis, if you look at the law of very large numbers, that suggests something bad is going to happen sometime soon. So the one thing I would just encourage is we start to understand how it is we're populating space and start looking at modeling this and figure out the ways that we can have the best of both worlds. Reduce the risk associated. I didn't say eliminate, it's inherently risky, but reduce the risk and also figure out how to maximize the use of space so that all nations around the world can enjoy the benefits.
Thank you, John. And actually, that is also the topic of the second working group that we have been having this past year, right? Which will present its results also in a session tomorrow. But agree that visibility is extremely important. Yes, Karti.
My name is Kumar Singharaja from Astroscale. Just to echo what the other industry speakers have said, perhaps the most important thing in the Paris Peace Forum Net Zero Space Declaration is not only should one achieve an objective by 2030, but one should start doing concrete actions by 2021 in those two particular areas which you, Madam Chair, highlighted. This is not, well, let me put it another way. This is an urgent and must-do action now, and that actually, the leadership for that should be actually driven by government policy and government regulations. Industry, curiously, in many different industry bodies have actually asked governments to take action. This has come from major trade associations, and just 3 facts which might convey why this is urgent. If you stopped all launches of all satellites, the residual space debris population will keep growing. This has been published by a number of space agencies, including European Space Agency very recently. The second point, and I don't want to over-dramatize it, but a very major space agency actually has said that they have observed the start of the Kessler effect in certain orbits today. Okay, that is somewhere around 700 kilometers. And the third issue is, if you look at a very recent aerospace cooperation space compendium, which they published actually a few weeks ago, there is a really interesting graph in that, which shows that, and it was actually commented on earlier today in another event, that probably 95% of the risk of collisions is not being assessed. Okay, there is some unknown, very deep iceberg out there, which is going to hit at some point in time. And in order to deal with it, the industry and as well and other space stakeholders who are operators need to be persuaded, probably by government action, to move on this very fast. If we wait for another 5 years for governments to change their policy and regulations, you will have maybe 50,000 other LEO satellites in an incredibly congested space, and that is really too late. I would put for proposition. Thank you.
Thank you, Kumar. Thomas.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Thomas Reiter. I'm representing the Association of Space Explorers, those people who are, for example, at the moment working on board the International Space Station. And I'm sure you are aware that not too many days ago there was actually a conjunction with one of the debris parts from one of these ESA tests. So for us, space debris is of course a very specific problem, especially when you are just working up there. And I can say that the Association of Space Explorers, about 400 cosmonauts, astronauts worldwide from 38 nations, obviously very, very much support this initiative, any initiative that helps to solve the problem. And in this context, I would like to underline what many of you already have said, that there is really an urgency in view of the developments that are taking place. The effect of collisions of anti-satellite tests have been mentioned, but I would like to add one aspect which is probably, well, certainly known to you, but in general public not very well known. Apart from this kind of collisions or fragmentations, the main source for debris are self-destruction or just explosions of older upper stages and so forth. So this is a kind of mechanism that still takes place on a regular basis, and that points to the need to also on a design level to take measures to improve the platforms, to adopt technologies. Now, without going too much into this detail, but one aspect I would like to point out here in this context, and I think also this is fully in line with what you have said, this is urgent, we need to take measures. Legislation on national level takes its time, on international level probably even a little bit longer. So what can we do by different means really to get under control if we see the number of satellite launches that are projected for the coming years? I have to say, I think everybody gets a little bit worried. So just to, in reference to this initiative, Zero Space Debris Initiative, I think one of the aspects could be to agree on a reduction of the maximum remaining time a satellite can have after its operational lifetime. IADC still, I think, defines something like 20 or 25 years, and I think it's clear this is too long. If we look at the statistics of clearing attempts in the orbit, there is space for improvement, let's put it like that. And my colleagues, I've been working for the European Space Agency, they even say if we would come to a clearing success of 90% or more with the increased number of launches we have, it would not solve the problem. So that just underlines the urgency. I think we can only support from the side of the Association of Space Explorers any initiative. And I think what we specifically can do, we have some papers where we have been thinking about some ideas about collision avoidance rules and so forth, but one of the aspects is really this outreach. Mr. Arsenault mentioned the awareness that probably still needs to improve on higher levels, but in general public also, and I think that is something that we can contribute to move forward a little bit quicker. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and that's indeed important. As astronauts, as we know, you are envoys of humankind, so that's, I think, would be a great help if we can have that outreach effort from the Association of Space Explorers. I'm going to take one more speaker on this topic before we move to the next. Luc? ClearSpace.
So my name is Luc Piguet. I'm the CEO and the co-founder of ClearSpace. We work on the ClearSpace 1 mission today, where the objective is to demonstrate the removal of a piece of debris from orbit. One thing that occurred to us when we started working on the problem at the very beginning was how big is the scale of the issue to address? Not the one at the moment we started the project, but the one that we will have to face in a few years from now. And so what we did is we looked at all the licenses that were out there, and obviously there were a huge number of satellites planned to be launched, and there still are, which led us to ask the question, how much of the licensing is just occupying licensing space and how much will effectively occupy space? So I think one of the first questions that have to be addressed on that is transparency on what is really an objective to launch a satellite and what is an objective to just occupy the licensing space to make sure that the space is occupied and to as an anti-competitive measure. So this is just one point. Another aspect is that obviously whatever the solution is, whatever the solutions are, and I think most of the measures proposed make a lot of sense, they cannot be taken alone. Right? They cannot be taken alone. The situation is kind of obvious. We have an environment where we still have regulation which are more or less at the level of horse carriage in an accelerating motorway environment, where the density of the traffic is really rapidly increasing, so change is obviously necessary. In our perspective, it is obviously a multidimensional solution that needs to be taken, and it is an ecosystem that has to be put in place that is sustainable. This means that whatever the solutions are for the different dimension, they have to make sense for the operators, and that's the way we approach, for example, ADR, because that's what we're working on. For us, ADR has to be a service an operator wants to buy because he needs it, not because he's forced to. Even though there's still the environment, the problem of the motivation of the different actors, what they're going to do. But I think the major issue that we see today is the fact that what's really needed is a leadership, because the solution is very difficult to solve at the global scale in one shot. There should be leading states that start driving the process. Like, okay, we take leadership on this problem, and we make sure that we start bringing together a number of states around a common vision about how this has to be operated. And what's happening here in the space industry is very similar to what we have on the motorway or on the road transportation industry, where there's a lot of regulation in place. And the regulation that is put in place is to make the traffic more agile and more safe. So there are pragmatic solutions that have to be put in place. And to our sense, really, it's leadership that is needed at this stage.
Thank you very much. I'd like to move to our second topic because the time goes very fast. And as you may have seen, the white paper also looks at also gives specific recommendations, and it does so in 3 categories. There are general recommendations, and there are recommendations about debris mitigation, and there are recommendations about debris remediation. They also are then split into short, sometimes medium and longer term. So it's a very extensive job that has been done. And I want to, by the way, compliment also Maria and Jérôme, who have worked very hard on getting us to where we are today with this paper. But also I want to invite 2 further of our experts around the table to give their views on this topic. And first I want to go to Jens Lundsgaard, who is Deputy Director of the Directorate of Science, Technology and Innovation of the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Jens held various positions at OECD between 2001 and 10 and returned this year. And in between, he was Deputy Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Business and Growth in Denmark, and also worked on the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Jens, please share your thoughts with us.
With pleasure, and many thanks for the good input. I think what's clear is that we need to act with leadership internationally. What we try to do at OECD is to bring evidence, to compile good recommendations, but I think we should also perhaps start thinking of what are the principles that should be governing what like-minded nations would try to do in order to go to action. If we should put 3 themes for the road ahead, I think I would start from effective monitoring. You pointed out very well that there's a kind of an iceberg here. We see items that are of some size. I think in low Earth orbit, we see things that are 10 centimeters or larger. In further out, we can see things that are at minimum 30 to 50 centimeters, but there's a lot more than that. And monitoring that would be a first thing, helped by those who are developing technologies in that domain. But beyond monitoring, there is also something that may not have been covered so much in the white paper, which is about simply complying, simply looking at when satellites are no longer in function, bringing them down. Are there simple things we can do even without developing new technologies? And lastly, of course, R&D, ways of doing deorbiting in new ways would be relevant. Japan, the European Space Agency, is doing a lot of work there. I wonder if this is a case where we should look at it a bit like we have done COVID vaccines. We have been able to collaborate internationally to speed up innovation and to develop what we can much faster than what was traditionally the case. When I got a license to fly an aircraft, I learned that when you see a little dot on the hood, it can be a fighter jet that will hit you in 6 seconds if it's on a colliding course. We may have more than 6 seconds, but definitely we need to go to action. We don't have to wait long. You can come back tomorrow at 4:30. It will not be men only. There will also be the OECD's very own Claire Joly at the panel. Thank you.
Excellent, I will be there. Thank you, Jens. I'm going to give the floor again to Luc Piguet, who is CEO and co-founder of ClearSpace and a graduate of the École Polytechnique Fédérale in Lausanne with a degree in electrical engineering and also an executive program at Stanford. And he co-founded ClearSpace with Muriel Richard-Noka in 2019, which is the result of a long-term project that began already in 2012 at the EPFL Space Center to develop technologies to capture and deorbit obsolete objects threatening space operations. And ClearSpace signed a service contract with ESA, European Space Agency, in 2020, worth 86.2 million euros for the ClearSpace 1 mission, which will be the first debris removal mission of the company in 2025. Luc.
So in the paper, a lot of emphasis is placed on transparency regarding trajectory, maneuvering, and intention. And our position on that is that obviously those are absolutely necessary for operation in space. They're obviously also not sufficient to establish a sustainable environment, sustainable economy. Simply just managing trajectory of object is collision avoidance does not address the fundamental problem that we're putting object in orbit faster than they are coming out of orbit. And this is just the very definition of instability. And unless we reach equilibrium in the standard, STM will be an ever-increasing challenge. And I think to give a comparison, we can look at the traffic again. I like the comparison of the traffic on the road because the number of orbits that are really valuable are discrete as the roads on the ground. And having better data is always useful, it's necessary, but it's not because we know where the broken cars are on the motorway using Waze that we will solve the problem on the long term. Regarding remediation, the white paper puts a lot of emphasis on state action, regulation, for ADR to take root. And as I mentioned before, I think our position is that ADR iOS should be a service that makes sense for operators. I like the way one of the attorneys from ESA puts it. He shows a picture of a crossing with a lot of cars and red lights and trucks and signals and says, and in this picture, every single part is regulated. Absolutely everyone. The size of the number plate on the cars, the size of the numbers or the letters in the signs, the color of the light, the way the light has to work and what the drivers have to do. But the whole objective of this is to make the traffic more agile and more safe, is to produce value. So I think there are regulations that do produce value, and that's how we should think about regulation, to create an environment that's sustainable, that makes sense, and that works. But then when it comes for us, when we look at the question of ADR itself, we have to produce solutions that produce value for operators as well. So it has to make sense. Clean operational orbit, insurance consideration, licensing conditions are important, liability, sustainable investment pressures, public relation, international corporate responsibility ethos are all trending towards supporting the adoption of responsible disposal operations. And we know that and we can observe that. It's actually trending in that direction much faster than what we expected when we started ClearSpace. And this is a good sign. This is a very good sign. I think what has to be done is bring consistency in this and coherence in the measures that are put in place. The paper also stresses the importance of international coordination, but then goes on to suggest that states can take unilateral actions to promote good behavior. Our position is that it might be an effective path to achieve international coordination, but there should be leadership. And that's what I mentioned before. It's really important that a set of states start leading the charge and say, okay, we get together and start driving a common decentralized regulation. That makes sense. What are the rules by which we're going to give licenses? What are the rules by which we're going to operate? What are the good practices? What is fair? What makes sense? And what provides a sustainable environment? So I just finished on the same note as at the beginning. I think there's obviously a need for states to take leadership. Today, there's already a lot of leadership going on. We see that, for example, with ESA that decided to lead the first mission to remove a debris and to demonstrate the complete value chain of a removal. JAXA in Japan does the same, works on the same objective. There's a lot of initiatives in the United States. So initiatives are starting when it comes to technological development. What we need is initiatives when it comes to how the system has to work and be regulated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and very interesting how you see that the industry should also be a product, or what you're doing should also be a product that the industry wants to have. Of course, there are also other considerations of legal aspirations, or who is going to pay for the mission, and for that, of course, we would still need some rules. And your idea of a kind of coalition of the willing is, I think, also interesting. It's possibly not possible, perhaps not possible, to have global agreement at the same time, and it's also what we see happening in other areas. But the whole fact of industry asking governments to act, I think that's quite a unique feature, and that's something that we should use. Going to open the floor. I see someone there, and then you.
So thank you, Jean-Luc Maria. I'm the CEO of Exotrail, so a small industrial company in France, and we are focused on in-space logistics solutions, so in-space mobility. So I think that's the right moment to give our thoughts as a new space player, and you know that the momentum is huge on this domain, so you have more and more company. So if I would say if feed the number of satellites, which is increasing in space, and so in our point of view, debris is one topic, but it's also completely linked to the other one that has been mentioned today, the space situational awareness data, which is fundamental when you want to operate something in space. It's also linked to the space traffic management, and it's also linked to the kind of sharing of data. And I'm going to give you an example. One of our products is what we call an OTV, an orbital transfer vehicle. So it's a kind of last mile delivery after the launch. Your satellite needs to reach the final position. And to propose this product to our customer, the idea behind is that we need to give our customer the access to space as often as possible. So our first concern here is that we are going to use multiple launchers in US, in Europe, in India, in Japan, for example. And so we need first to be aware of all the regulation. So that's typically the recommendation number one of the white paper. And let's start with that, because when we are, let's say, a small player, we need to have a clear visibility of all the regulation. Once we are in space, we are able to, we are going to move our orbital transfer vehicle. So we are going to do altitude change, plane change, inclination change. And so to do that, we need SSA data. So we need as complete as possible catalog of SSA data. So that's really key in this topic. And when we are going to plan a maneuver, we should, I would say to somebody that we are going to move in space. But right now, we do not have the answer. We are going to move, but do we have to tell that we are going to move? So that's really an issue we have today. So I think when we are thinking about debris, because the in-orbit services at the wall, that what we are doing, is potentially a solution to remediate to debris. And as it was mentioned also, it's potentially a source of debris also if we are not able to properly do things in space. So just in conclusion, I really would like to highlight that when we are speaking about debris, we need also to speak about space traffic management, space situational awareness data. That's really the key. And I think that one of the next activity of the group will be also to focus on in-orbit services as well, exactly for that purpose.
Thank you very much for those good comments. You, sir, and then you.
Yes, so let me quickly introduce myself. I'm Frank, running Orbit Recycling. And what we heard about is all these problems we have with space debris, but I also like the concept you introduced with why not thinking about how we can leapfrog and turn this problem in something where people love to work against it. So turn this problem into something like an opportunity. And probably this cannot be done only with the space industry and the space players itself. So I promote that idea that why not giving a certain region the chance to turn their debris into a resource accessible to their local region and saying, let's find out if that is a resource which has some values and not only threats. And where I come from is it's really about the recycling aspect. And the recycling industry is 10 times the size of the space industry in Europe, right? There's a lot of value, there's a lot of expertise, and if we would open these debris and say, hey, it's an accessible resource, dear recycling industry, have you ever thought about going to space and help us removing that problem? These few companies there, with a lot of financial resources behind, would be more than happy to extend their market to that as well. They still have to solve all these technical problems we discussed here, right? They still have the same problem in awareness about tracking the debris and so on. But they bring in the expertise to turn this debris into something which I have here in my hand. This is recycled space debris, right? It's an Ariane 5 upper stage recast in moon dust, and we can sell it to anybody who wants to do some aluminum stuff on the moon, for example. And bringing in these new ideas, I think, is crucial to attack this problem, because we generated that problem as a space industry over years, over decades. And are we the best to solve it? Maybe from a technical point of view, but from the idea behind what to do with this, maybe some fresh ideas from outside could help us to address it even much, much better than we can do alone.
Thank you. That's very interesting, because then you would actually be making products in space. So again, legally, I will have plenty of questions, but we don't have that much time. I'm going to you, sir.
Yeah, thank you. I represent Project Kuiper, which is Amazon's low Earth orbital constellation. I'm glad to be with you today, because sustainability is definitely a core tenet of this program. And we believe that it's essential to rely on industry standards, industry best practices to get there. It has been said already by several speakers, but speed matters for obvious reasons. Also, flexibility matters, because there is innovation and we should leverage on that. And therefore, it's important to leverage on best practices. And at Kuiper, we are working in a number of directions to make space sustainable. We are in particular working on system design with a constellation that is at a low altitude between 590 and 630 kilometers, which enables deorbiting. We also concentrate to avoid overlapping with other trajectories, right? Then we work on satellite design to make sure that our satellites have an autonomous propulsion system capability, to also work on their components, to protect the key components. And we are also committed to sharing data, ephemeridess data, and operational plans. And finally, we deorbit satellites in a way that answers a question that was also discussed. So there is a lot to leverage on best practices. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Kumar.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a brief couple of comments. First of all, on the Working Group 1 report, it's a fantastic report. It provides a menu of options, regulatory options, technical options, etc. SSA and STM are very, very important, and in coming years, in-orbit servicing, including active debris removal and future in-orbit service, is also very important. But on the question of whether one can rely on operators, whether they are launch operators or satellite operators, to do the good stuff, I take a slightly different view to look to provoke discussion. And I've worked, as some of you know, for several decades for satellite operators. Satellite operators are basically driven by only two things: make money and profit, or do stuff if governments tell them they should do it. So I'll just close by an analogy. Sometimes some of us will go for dinner at a restaurant, and our wives will tell us, "You shall be home by 11 o'clock. Do not go to the bar, and don't turn up in the morning looking bad." We tend to ignore that as gentlemen going out in the evening, because we treat that as guidelines. There is no incentive or penalty for poor behavior. And by analogy, I would just say that it's actually a very good analogy for real-world behavior in the industrial world out there. And I would just encourage and repeat the plea that regulation should move faster at government level, obviously by a group of states which can lead and would lead in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Jens has a comment.
Yeah, I feel inspired by what you're saying, because basically, putting this on the table, putting it clearly on the table for policymakers, making them realize that this is moving so fast. I mean, just think, 3 years ago, we had something like 800 satellites in use in low orbit. Now we have, what, 4,000, something like that. We're looking to, as we heard, a lot more. And I think, indeed, if we can work together to sort of describe what is it economically? I mean, there can be revenue streams that people haven't thought of yet. That would be wonderful, and we are definitely happy to work with you on that. And also, as you say, find the balance between analysis, recommendations, and let's say principles for how leading nations can collaborate to say these are the good standards that everybody actually globally should follow.
Thank you. One last quick comment, well, two last quick comments, because my time is clocking.
Yes, on SSA, I couldn't agree more with many things that have been said. I think it underlies the need for regulation, that we need better SSA. The OECD recent report underlined this, that the current systems, governmental systems, cannot follow what's in space right now. We need more SSA and better SSA. And I believe for 3 reasons that have been outlined, and if I use the teenager analogy, to better regulate and understand how we need to put regulation in place, we need better SSA. And I think that's what we have in this paper. But then to ensure compliance as well, we need to better look at who does what in space and how. And then I would add, maybe to your point, for unknown reasons that are coming, that are needed by new technologies or new commercial models, we need better SSA. We need to see who does what and how debris, where it is, where it's going. So I think it's fundamental here.
I think there's a lot of great ideas here, and I do look forward to our work over the next year. The one thing I would ask folks to think about as we vet these ideas, I think it's really important that we focus on solving the root cause of the current crisis, because there's a risk that as we rush forward, we treat the symptoms. And if we only treat the symptoms, we're just going to perpetuate the problem. So one of the things we have been urging as we think about a lot of these terrific ideas is model them and see if they really are going to move the needle, and then try to work on the things that are likely to be most effective. Doesn't mean the other ideas are bad ideas, it's just we can't do everything at once.
Thank you so much. We've heard a lot of good ideas, and I think even being around the table here and sharing these thoughts with each other, with all these different stakeholders, is a very important and useful step. We've heard several times that we need transparency, that we need visibility, that we need data, SSA, STM, SST, all the acronyms that you're familiar with. We've heard also that it's important to involve the industry, that we have to involve civil society, that we need to reach out and create awareness, and that awareness then has to be transposed into political action. I believe the awareness is there. I have the impression that the awareness that the clock is ticking is present, but we now need to convince governments and also the operators and other players that the time for action is now. I quite liked the parallel with the pandemic. I don't know if it's appropriate, but perhaps we should say we have a debris pandemic and we need to develop that vaccine. I want to close with one parallel that I was thinking of during our session, even though the clock is now stopped. But if we look at the adoption of the long-term sustainability guidelines by the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, which was a process that took about 10 years and which resulted in 20 guidelines with lots of sub guidelines. I think there's 150 or so of them, comparable perhaps to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. You see that states are now asked to implement them. These are non-legally binding guidelines. States are going to implement them. So you see it goes from the top to the bottom, but at the same time you have also the industry that is creating initiatives and like the Net Zero Space Declaration and others that are there. So I think that if we combine all that top-down, bottom-up industry initiatives and transparency, we should be able to meet the goal and create the zero debris environment by 2030. Thank you for your contributions, and I wish you a good end of the day.